Romantic Realism, French Landscape Painting. Before we can talk about French landscape painting, it's first important to understand the historic background. The July monarchy was between 1830 and 1848. If you recall the timeline of French history, in 1815 Napoleon was defeated. From 1815 to 1824, Louis XVIII was put into place by neighboring nations. He was from the House of Bourbon, and he was the last monarch in France to die while reigning. From 1824 to 1830, Charles X was also from the House of Bourbon, succeeded Louis XVIII. He was very unpopular, and this led to an uprising, which was called the Three Glorious Days. If you can see on the right, Liberty Leading the People by Eugene Delacroix is a depiction of these Three Glorious Days. The woman holding the flag in the middle is Marianne, who is a symbol of France. From 1830 to 1848, Louis Philippe from the House of Orléans, not the House of Bourbon, was a constitutional monarch that was put in place to replace Charles X. Although he was supposed to be for the people and was labeled King of the French, not King of France, he was mainly for the bourgeoisie, and this led to him being very unpopular. In 1848, another uprising took place and the monarchy was abolished. After the abolition of the monarchy, the Second Republic was put in place. Many artistic movements began during this time. The first artistic movement is the avant-garde. The avant-garde means literally the advance guard or the vanguard. It was coined by the French army and by the scouts who would go before everyone else. So in art, it means the people who come before others, or the people who are ahead of the curve. It was first mentioned in 1825 in the political programs of the French Utopian Society. The other artistic movement that was very important during this time is Realism. This took place between 1840 and 1880. It was a reaction to the strict romanticism in history painting. Realists wanted to depict life as it was. They didn't want to idealize it or make it completely exotic. Romantic realism is a type of realism where they express a romantic attitude or meaning. In other words, it evokes emotion from real life. Realism was a reaction to the political climate of the time. Because Louis Philippe favored the bourgeoisie, there were rising food prices, high unemployment, and political rebellion. Realism was also linked to naturalist literature. Émile Zola, Charles Dickens, and Balzac were authors that depicted the lower classes in a realistic light. Realism also was a commitment to paint the world honestly. They didn't want to turn away from the brutal truths of life, and they also wanted to show ordinary people. Landscape painters showed relief from the chaos and grit of the city. Gustave Courbet was one of the first painters to paint exactly what he saw. The rapid expansion of the city is shown in the railway lines in Paris from 1850 to 1870. It grew exponentially. The major realist painters during this time were Gustave Courbet, which we'll discuss Tuesday, Théodore Rousseau, Charles-François d'Aubigny, Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, and Jean-François Millet. These artists were part of a school called the Barbizon School, and the leaders of this school were Rousseau. It was called the Barbizon School because it was located in the village of Barbizon, France. These painters painted in plein air, which means out of doors, and they generally painted in the Fontainebleau forest. They would actually sketch outside and paint outside, and they would paint directly from nature. Rousseau's portrayal of the forest is shown in the Forest of Fontainebleau sunset and the Forest of Fontainebleau morning. As you can see, there is an atmospheric effect with soft brush strokes and clearly delineated leaves. It is also a precursor to Impressionism, where he's painting the same scene at different times of the day. So you can see the way the light hits the leaves and it evokes different colors at different times of the day. In sunset, they're a little bit more muted, and in the morning, they're a little bit brighter, except that the foreground is a little bit more shadowed. The details to nature can be seen in contemporary photographs of the same subject matter. Eugene Cuvier took pictures of the Fontainebleau forest, and as you can see, they're really similar to Rousseau's painting. Landscape painting as a genre was very popular. It represented about 25 to 30% of all exhibited paintings. People wanted landscape paintings to decorate their homes, and they were sold not only at the salon but also in shops. There were three major trends of landscape painting during the July monarchy: historic landscape, picturesque, and naturalistic. The first major trend of landscape painting is historical landscape painting. As the title would suggest, it combines history painting and landscapes. It was a tradition upheld by the Academy, and it was mostly done by conservative artists, although it did attract some innovative artists. One such artist is Corot. He was the greatest landscape painter of his time. The painting on the left is Hagar in the Wilderness. It is in 1835, and it shows the story of Hagar, who was the servant of Abraham. It shows the biblical scene of Abraham and Sarah, who couldn't conceive a child, and so she had the servant of Abraham, Hagar, sleep with Abraham, and they had a child together called Ishmael. And then Sarah asked Hagar. It is a historical painting because it depicts a biblical scene, but it is also a landscape painting. Corot's contemporaries felt it surpassed ordinary historic landscape because the harmony between Hagar's despair and the desolate landscape are very, very similar. It's also based on pictorial observation, and it looks like it was depicted directly from nature. Corot studied directly from nature, and he also sketched out of doors. The second major trend of painting is called the picturesque. The picturesque is a little bit hard to define, but it usually is a pleasing synthesis of contradicting categories. It fills the gap between beauty and the sublime, and it's usually nature with some sort of ruins in it. It was brought over to France by In the picturesque, there are strong contrasts between light and dark. In this picture, the light and dark is caused by the storm, and it causes a dramatic effect. But it also is very similar to the sublime effect of evoking emotion and beauty from nature. The last and most important trend of landscape painting during the July monarchy is naturalism. Naturalism was influenced by the work of English painter John Constable. Here, artists depicted woods and fields in France. Again, the leader of this movement was Rousseau, and he painted landscapes close to his home in the Fontainebleau forest, and this was near the village of Barbizon, which gave the name to the Barbizon School, which was the center of landscape painting. The modernization of Paris, including industrialization, haussmanization, resulted in the many perceived as dirty, crowded, and artificial environments, the opposite of the outdoors. Théophile Touret, a good friend and supporter of many of the Barbizon painters, talked about Rousseau as having a lovingly reproduced version of nature. Although Rousseau was the leader of the Barbizon school and was a legendary painter, he was rarely seen in the salons. This is because he was refused from the years 1836 to 1941. The primary sources for this week, the first one is actually mislabeled. It's Touret talking, and he called Millet and Courbet realists. He also says to be a master is to resemble no one and also to regenerate nature. And you have to keep in mind that Millet is educated. He knows the Bible, Dante, Latin, Shakespeare, and he can make allusions to these in his works. In his writing, he says, I try to express a rustic feeling in what I do. He's trying to find the rustic goodness. He's also trying to show people in their daily life the way they're actually working, and not as this horrible thing, but also not as this ideal situation. And he likens tasks to Christ. So when he's talking about people in the fields, he's also talking about like the working of Christ. And so when you look at these works, it's important to understand that there's a deeper meaning than just the one that's on face value. And also, Millet is called a socialist because his work depicts work. The realists are generally associated with politics and having political meaning in their works because they do depict ordinary people. Baudelaire also talked about the realists. Specifically, he talked about Corot. He said that Corot bridged an old and new way of looking at landscape. And this is important because the realists were placed situationally between the Impressionists and the Neoclassicists. Rousseau, as we mentioned, is the most important naturalist landscape painter. He was born in 1812 and lived until 1867. His parents were part of a successful merchant class. As a child, he showed an interest in art and nature. He spent a great deal of time in the Louvre and studied Dutch 17th century landscapes. He also studied the great masters, and you can see this in his colors, which are reminiscent of Rubens, and also the similarities between his landscapes and those of Poussin. He was also aware of John Constable, which we'll see. As we mentioned before, Rousseau was aware of John Constable's work. You can see the similarities in the atmospheric effects, although Rousseau paid more attention to different times of the day. His works are also have a feeling of representing the woods at the Fontainebleau, whose trees, some that were 100 years old, were subject to harvest, a practice Rousseau bitterly opposed. Thus, the open space in the painting is not a natural feature of the landscape, but the edge of a threatened grove of ancient specimens. Another important part of Rousseau's work is that he includes planes of parallel strips, a compositional device he called planimetric. Rousseau's painting, Sunset over a Plain of Barbizon, immediately makes one recall the sublime, although it also has a sad feel to it. Rousseau's pictures are always grave in character, with an air of exquisite melancholy which is powerfully attractive to the lover of landscapes. They are well finished when they profess to be complete pictures, but Rousseau spends so much time working up his subjects, and his absolutely completed works are comparatively few. He left many canvases with parts of the picture realized in details, and the remainder is somewhat vague, as you can see in this picture, where the grass and the trees seem to have details, but then there are little vague parts to the left. And again, you see the horizontal planes that are prevalent within this picture. As you can also see, this is a precursor to Impressionism. Rousseau is painting at different times of the day, which is similar to what Claude Monet did in his Impressionism. The brushstrokes are loose, and you can actually see the brushwork. Charles de Vigny was another naturalist landscape painter. De Vigny's finest pictures were painted between 1864 and 1874, and these, for the most part, were carefully completed landscapes with trees, rivers, and a few ducks. It has been said that when de Vigny liked his pictures, he added another duck or two. So if there are a lot of ducks in the pictures, it means he really liked the picture. He is most known for living on his boat, Botan, which he converted into a studio. This allowed him to paint directly on the rivers that he captured. His paintings are like Rousseau's in that they have a lot of horizontal planes, although water is usually the most pronounced feature in his paintings, and you can see the mirror-like surface of the water. Another famous landscape painter and printmaker is Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot. He references neoclassical tradition and foreshadows plein air impressionism in his work. His work is typically separated between his early period, where the work is tight, there's an exactness, there are clear outlines and thin brushwork, and definition in objects. And when he's a little bit older, his methods have more tones and they show the poetic power of painting, and there is a thicker application to the paint. And here you see the real romanticist realism. Corot approached painting more traditionally than is typically believed. Many people think he is more of an impressionist, but his palette is more restrained than Impressionism. It's dominated with browns and blacks, and these are not allowed in Impressionism. And his strokes are also careful and controlled, and his compositions are carefully thought out to give a poetry and an emotional effect to his imagery. Corot's Bridge at Nantes is very similar to Nicolas Poussin's landscape with the burial of Phocéon. It's a little bit different in that Corot's landscape looks real. It looks like you're there, and it has more of an immediacy to it, whereas Poussin's looks like you're looking at it from afar. This shows Corot's earlier work, where the lines are very clear, unlike his later work where you have thicker paint application. This, it seems like they're very thin, which you can see specifically in the branches, which are almost like a... Corot painted this study during the summer of 1832 and 1834 in Bois Braux, a section of the forest of Fontainebleau that was famous for its immense oak trees. At the time, Corot was living in a nearby village. He painted this in a naturalistic style he had developed in Italy while he was living there from 1825 to 1828. The trees reappear in Hagar in the Wilderness, a large canvas he exhibited at the 1835 Paris Salon. And probably in his realization of that biblical scene, Corot transported the oak from northern France to the Palestine desert. One can also see the clear delineations of the forest in this picture. It looks real. It looks as if you were standing right there, and there is a sense of immediacy in the picture. You can also see in the background that you can see it's about noon time of day because the sun is high and it's casting a shadow on the trees. Souvenir de Montfontaine, or Memory of Montfontaine, you can see an older work of Corot. Here the tonal qualities are more apparent. The background almost seems like a mist. In the foreground there's a thicker application of paint to the tree. It also evokes more of an emotion and it has a poetic quality. And it's similar to the naturalist poetry of the time where you're trying to evoke an emotion or a feeling of being out of doors as a reaction to the industrialization that's taking place in Paris. By the time Corot sent this small canvas and another one to the 1870 Salon, he had long enjoyed the privilege of exhibiting his entries without submitting them to the jury. Secure in his reputation, he showed modest works, as if to reassure a nation about to enter a war with Prussia that all was well at Ville d'Avray, and also that all was well in his studio. Corot depicted the villas at the far side of the large pond at Ville d'Avray, where he had inherited property from his parents. It is a scene he painted frequently, but each time he took certain liberties, the tree in the foreground changing most often. Because of the silhouette of branches against the pewter sky, Corot's biographer, Albert Roubaud, called this work the spider's web. Spider's web branches would be apparent in many of Corot's paintings. Initially, Corot included a child to the right of the peasant woman in the foreground, although this was removed. Engraved copies of works were also popular during this time. An engraved copper plate could be printed upwards of 100 times before the repeated pressing took its toll on the quality of the image. In the later 19th century, artists increasingly used steel engraving, wood engraving, and lithography for printing. These more durable surfaces could print up to 10,000 copies of an image without much loss of quality, though only a few artists experienced the demand for this type of print. Jean-Francois Millet was born in a farming community. He was the son of a Norman peasant, and although he was born as a farmer, he was very well educated and he studied Latin and portrait painting. Portrait painting would be seen in his later works, as you can see the attention to detail. He moved to Paris in 1837 and he met Rousseau in the 1840s. Unlike Rousseau, though, he was accepted into the Salon. Millet was very successful. In 1870, he was elected to the Salon jury. He was also thought to use canvases because of shortages in the Franco-Prussian War. The MFA did an x-ray of one of his paintings and found another one beneath it. He was accused of being a socialist because the subject matter in his painting depicted real workers. He is most known for his iconic 3 paintings, The Sower, The Gleaners, and The Angelus. Millet's most famous work, The Gleaners, painted in 1857, depicts one of his favorite subjects, peasant life. These women incarnate the rural working class. They were authorized to go quickly to the fields at sunset and pick the grain after the harvest, and so it shows the backbreaking work of the women. As you can see, they're all below the horizon line, which puts them in with the land, and shows that the people are part of the land. The slanting light of the setting sun accentuates the volumes in the foreground and gives the gleaners a sculptural look. It picks out their hands, necks, and shoulders and backs and brightens the colors of their clothing. You can see the modeling and that Millet was trained academically in the body depictions of each of the gleaners. Of these simple people, he creates certainly realistic figures, but they're also anonymous. This turns them into archetypes, as if he wants to show the unchanging and sacred nature of their daily gestures. The painting understood in this way ceases to be purely a spectacle. It raises it up into a moralizing and educational role. The ordinary person is channeled through the artist, and with a great noble picture, we have a lesson in social and political morals. This is probably why Millet was called a socialist, because he focused on the ordinary people and made them archetypes, so that people would look at the conditions of the working class. As you can see, the people's poverty is juxtaposed against the lusciousness of the harvest, which shows their austerity even clearer next to the full fields. In the background, you can also see the loose brushwork, which is a precursor to the clouds are also reminiscent of John Constable's. Again, Millet depicts an anonymous man working in the field. This painting, The Sower, which is at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, was actually commissioned for a work for a state building. And here Millet takes a subtle decision that would activate all types of reactions. He decides to portray the peasant life in a personal and realistic way. In it, he abandons all the conformist style and he paints the suffering of the workers, their solitude and their determination. In 1850, Millet gets a financial sponsor, and the same year he submits The Sower to the Salon. This was a huge scandal. You may wonder why. In 1848, there was a workers' revolution that had taken place under the flag of universal rights to work that allowed the creation of the Second French Republic. In this political scenery, the conservatives reacted negatively to The Sower because the painting focused on the real subject rather than the idealized version that they were used to. The background of Millet's Sower is similar to Corot's mistiness, and also of the mistiness seen in the work of the Barbizon school. In the center is a sketch. This would not have been seen in the public and only in the artist's studio. Conversely, the prints on the far right would have been disseminated to the masses. The most important parts of naturalist realist paintings is that they were largely political, they sketched from outdoors, and that there was an industrialized and dysfunctional political climate at the time, and it was a reaction to this. All of the information found in the works was retrieved from Stokstad's art history book, Chu's 19th-century painting, the museum websites of the Musée d'Orsay, the Met, and other blogs. Please, if you would like to know where I have cited this information from, you can email me and I will provide you with the full bibliography. Also, please remember to read the primary source readings for this week, and good luck studying Romantic Realism.